striking or punching through it. During the late 1930s, S-shaped charge ammunition was experimented with that used chemical energy for armor penetration. The shaped charge concept is officially known as the Munro effect and was discovered by accident decades earlier by Professor Charles E. Munro at the U.S. Torpedo Station, Providence, RI. Professor Munro was detonating different manufactured blocks of explosives on a sheet of armor plating and observed the block shaving the manufacturing letters recessed versus raised, cut an imprint of the manufacturing letters into thermal plate, the birth of the shaped charged explosive, which focuses the blast energy caused by an indentation on the surface area of an explosive. 6. Although shaped charges are somewhat more difficult to manufacture, the advantage is that the projectile does not require as high velocity as typical kinetic energy shells, yet on impact it creates a high-velocity jet of metal flowing like a liquid due to the immense pressure, though X-ray diffraction has shown the metal stays solid. 7. Which hydrodynamically penetrates the armor and kills occupants inside. 8. The depth of the penetration, though proportional to the length of the jet and the square root of its density, is also dependent on the strength of the armor. With the development of this new ammunition begun more advanced research into steel manufacturing, and development of space ore that caused jet waver by detonating prematurely or at the wrong angle to the surface of the main armor. The only significant attempt to experiment in the use of tanks in the late 1920s was that of the British Army's experimental mechanized force that influenced future development of tanks, armored troops and entire armies of both its future enemies and allies in the next war. In Spain, the anti-tank defense of the nationalists was organized by the Wehrmacht officers, and the anti-tank guns were incorporated into a system of obstacles that were constructed with the intent to stop an attack by tanks by slowing it down, separating them from supporting infantry, advancing on foot, with machine gun and mortar fire, and forcing tanks to conduct deliberate head-on assaults with engineer support, or seek a less defended area to attack. Minefields laid with purpose-designed mines were used for the first time, destroying tank tracks, and forcing combat engineers to clear them on foot. Delay meant that nationalist field artillery could engage the lightly armored Soviet tanks. This meant a change in Republican operational and eventually strategic planning, and a more protracted combat operations, with more casualties at a greater cost. The only change to the German anti-tank tactics of the First World War was that now an effective anti-tank weapon was available to support the defending infantry. However, the Soviet tanks armed with 45mm guns easily destroyed the German light tanks. Ironically, in the early 1930s until the Spanish War, German officers were conducting secret testing of a new way of employing tanks, infantry and artillery offensively in the Soviet Union with the cooperation of Red Army. In Germany, these developments eventually culminated in tactics that later came to be known as Blitzkrieg, while in the Soviet Union they formed the core of the deep battle operational doctrine. The successful test of the latter was during the battles of Karp-Hingol, although the Red Army founded on the Mannerheim Line in 1940, largely due to the purge in the officer corps, claiming many of the senior proponents of the new doctrine. Anti-tank artillery would be included in mobile tank-led Wehrmacht and Red Army units due to the possibility of encountering enemy tanks in a meeting engagement. The new doctrines of using the tank were divided into infantry and cavalry schools of thought. The former regarded the tank as a mobile artillery system to be used for infantry support. This suggested that the infantry needed to be armed with integral anti-tank weapons. The latter advocated use of tanks in the traditional cavalry way of high-tempo attacks intended to outflank the enemy infantry and sever its communication lines. This approach suggested that the tank was the best anti-tank system, and only limited anti-tank troops were required to accompany them. For this reason the late 30s tank configurations came in a great diversity, ranging from light tankettes and cavalry tanks to multi-turreted heavy tanks resembling bunkers, all of which had to be considered in training by the anti-tank artillery troops. The development of these doctrines was the most significant influence on the rapid development in anti-tank technology and tactics in the Second World War. Second World War. Two aspects of how the Second World War commenced helped to delay development of anti-tank warfare: resignation and surprise. After Poland was attacked, its allies in the West were resigned to its defeat by a numerically superior Wehrmacht. The little information that was brought out about the conduct of combat during that campaign did nothing to convince either France, Britain or the USSR of the need for improved anti-tank technology and tactics. The reliance on the Maginot Line, and the subsequent surprise of the German offensive left no time to develop existing abilities and tactics in the West. The British were preparing the stop lines and the anti-tank islands to slow enemy progress and restrict the route of an attack. The Red Army, however, was fortunate in having several excellent designs for anti-tank warfare that were either in final stages of development for production, or had been rejected earlier as unnecessary and could now be rushed into production. The relative ease with which the older models of Red Army's tank fleet were destroyed by German anti-tank weapons, using tactics already seen in Spain, once and for all focused Stavka attention on anti-tank warfare as Soviet armies were repeatedly encircled by panzer-led strategic pincer maneuvers. Of the major iconic Soviet weapons of the Second World War, two were made exclusively for anti-tank warfare: the T-34 and the Ilyushin Il-2 Shturmovik. The former was one of the most manufactured tanks in history, and the latter, itself dubbed the Flying Tank, was one of the most manufactured aircraft. The war also saw the creation and almost immediate abandonment of the self-propelled tank destroyer, which would be replaced post-war by the anti-tank guided missile aircraft. Soviet Ilyushin Il-2 planes with 23mm cannons attacking a German tank column during the Battle of Kursk as tanks were rarely used in conflicts between the two world wars. No specific aircraft or tactics were developed to combat them from there. One solution adopted by almost all European air forces was to use bomb loads for conventional bombers that were composed from small bombs, allowing a higher density during bombing. This created a greater chance of causing a direct impact on the thinner top armor of the tank, while also having the ability to damage track and wheels through proximity detonation. The first aircraft able to engage tanks was the Junkers Ju-87 Stuka, using dive bombing to place the bomb close to the target. Some French and German fighters fitted with 20mm cannon reels were able to engage thinner top armor surfaces of the tanks early in the war. The Stuka was also given cannons for anti-armor role, though it was obsolete by 1942, and was joined by the Henschel HS-129 that mounted a powered 30mm, 1.2-in, Mk101 cannon beneath its fuselage, while the Red Army Air Force fielded the Soviet Ilyushin Il-2 armed with a pair of 23mm cannons and unguided rockets, but armored to enable the pilots to approach German tanks at very low altitude, ignoring small arms, machine gun and even small anti-aircraft cannon fire that usually provided tanks with protection against the bombers. Il-2s could also carry large numbers of 2.5 kg shaped charge anti-tank TAC bombs. To give it more firepower against tanks, the RAF mounted two underwing pod-mounted 40mm Vickers cannon on the Hawker Hurricane, as the Mkiid, which saw service in North Africa in 1942, and the Hawker Typhoon was given He rockets, though these were more effective against other ground vehicles. From March 1943 the Red Army Air Force produced the more agile Yakov Yak-90, 37mm cannon, and K-45mm cannon, bomber. Interceptor also used for ground attack. with one example of either gun in Motornaya Pushka mounts attached to the engine's gear reduction unit, that had either one of them firing through a hollow center propeller shaft. Following Operation Overlord in 1944, the military version of the slow-flying Piper J-3 Cup high-wing light civilian monoplane, the L-4 Grasshopper, usually used for liaison and artillery spotting, began to burst in a light anti-armor role by a few U.S. Army artillery spotter units over France. These aircraft were airfield outfitted with either 2 or 4 bazooka rocket launchers attached to the lift struts, 9, against German armored fighting vehicles. During the summer of 1944, U.S. Army Major Charles Carpenter managed to successfully take on an anti-armor role with his rocket-armed Piper L-4. His L-4, named Rosie the Rocketeer, armed with 6 bazookas, had a notable anti-armor success during an engagement during the Battle of Aricourt on the 20th of September, 1944, knocking out at least 4 German armored vehicles, 10, as a pioneering example of taking on heavy enemy armor from a lightweight slow-flying aircraft. 11. Field artillery. Field artillery were often the first ground combat arm to engage detected concentration of troops, which included tanks through artillery airborne observers, either in assembly areas, for refueling and rearming, during approach marches to the combat zone, or as the tank unit was forming up for the attack. Conventional artillery shells were very effective against the tank's thinner top armor if fired in appropriate intensity while the tanks were concentrated, enabling direct hits by a sufficiently powerful shell. Even a non-penetrating shell could still disable a tank through dynamic shock, internal armor shattering or simply overturning the tank. More importantly, the tanks could be disabled due to damage to tracks and wheels, and the supporting vehicles and personnel could be damaged and killed, reducing units' ability to fight in the longer term. Because tanks were usually accompanied by infantry mounted on trucks or half-tracked vehicles that lacked overhead armor, field artillery that fired a mix of ground and air-burst ammunition was likely to inflict heavy casualties on the infantry as well. Field guns, such as the Ordnance QF 25-pounder, were provided with armor-piercing shot for direct engagement of enemy tanks. Anti-tank guns. Both as 37mm anti-tank gun as used by several nations. Anti-tank guns are guns designed to destroy armored vehicles from defensive positions. In order to penetrate vehicle armor, they fire smaller caliber shells from longer barreled guns to achieve higher muzzle velocity than field artillery weapons, many of which are howitzers. The higher velocity, flatter trajectory ballistics provide terminal kinetic energy to penetrate the moving forward/static target's armor at a given range and contact's angle. Any field artillery cannon with barrel length 15 to 25 times longer than its caliber was able also to fire anti-tank ammunition, such as the Soviet A-19. Prior to World War II, few anti-tank guns had, or needed, calibers larger than 50mm. Examples of guns in this class include the German 37mm, US 37mm, the largest gun able to be towed by the 1/4-ton, 4-4 Jeep, French 25mm and 47mm guns, British QF 2-pounder, 40mm, Italian 47mm and Soviet 45mm. All of these light weapons could penetrate the thin armor found on most pre-war and early war tanks. German Pak 38 50mm anti-tank gun. At the start of World War II, many of these weapons were still being used operationally, along with a newer generation of light guns that closely resembled their WWI counterparts. After the well-armored Soviet T-34 medium and KV heavy tanks were encountered, these guns were recognized as ineffective against sloped armor, with the German lightweight 37mm gun quickly nicknamed the tank door knocker, German Panzeranklopfgerät, for revealing its presence without penetrating the armor. Germany introduced more powerful anti-tank guns, some of which had been in the early stages of development prior to the war. By late 1942, the Germans had an excellent 50mm high-velocity design while they faced the QF 6-pounder introduced in the North African campaign by the British Army, and later adopted by the US Army. By 1943, Wehrmacht was forced to adopt still larger calibers on the Eastern Front, the 75mm and the famous 88mm guns. The Red Army used a variety of 45mm, 57mm, and 100mm guns, and deployed general-purpose 76.2mm and 122mm guns in the anti-tank role. By the time of the invasion of Normandy, the British had the 3-in, 76mm, caliber QF 17-pounder, which design had begun before the 6-pounder entered service, in general use, which proved to be a highly effective anti-tank and was also used on the Sherman Firefly tank, the Archer self-propelled gun, and on the 17 PDR Specialist tank destroyers. The British Archer self-propelled anti-tank gun put the 17 PDR gun on the hull of a Valentine tank as towed anti-tank cannon guns grew in size and weight. They became less mobile and more cumbersome to maneuver, and required ever larger gun crews, who often had to wrestle the goon into position while under heavy artillery and forward/or tank fire. As the war progressed, this disadvantage often resulted in the loss or destruction of both the anti-tank gun and its trained crew. This gave impetus to the development of the self-propelled, lightly armored tank destroyer, TD. The tank destroyer was usually based on the hull of existing tank designs, using either a gun integrated into the hull or a fully rotating turret much like that of a conventional tank. These self-propelled, SP-AD guns were first employed as infantry support weapons in place of towed anti-tank guns. Later, due to a shortage of tanks, TDs sometimes replaced the former in offensive armored operations. Early German-designed tank destroyers, such as the Marder I, employed existing light French or Czech-designed tank chassis, installing an AD gun as part of an armored, turretless superstructure. This method reduced both weight and conversion costs. The Soviet Union later adopted this style of self-propelled anti-tank gun or tank destroyer. This type of tank destroyer had the advantage of a reduced silhouette, allowing the crew to more frequently fire from defiled ambush positions. Such designs were easier and faster to manufacture and offered good crew protection, though the lack of a turret limited the gun's traverse to a few degrees. This meant that, if the TD became immobilized due to engine failure or track damage, it could not rotate its gun to counter opposing tanks, making it an easy target. This vulnerability was later exploited by opposing tank forces. Late in the war, it was not unusual to find even the largest and most powerful tank destroyer abandoned on the field after a battle, having been immobilized by one high-explosive shell to the track or front drive sprocket. US Army pre-war infantry support doctrines emphasized the use of tank destroyers with open-top fully rotating turrets, featuring less armor than the standard M4 Sherman tanks, but with more powerful cannon. A 76mm long-barrel tank cannon was fitted to the Sherman-based M10 GMC. And all new design M18 designs, with the M18 being the fastest-moving American AFV of any type in World War II. 12. Late in 1944, the Sherman Origin M36 appeared, equipped with a 90mm cannon. With rotating turrets and good combat maneuverability, American TD designs generally worked well, although their light armor was no match for enemy tank cannon fire during one-on-one confrontations. Another disadvantage proved to be the open, unprotected turret, and casualties from artillery fire soon led to the introduction of folding armor turret covers. Near the war's end, a change in official doctrine caused both the self-propelled tank destroyer and the towed anti-tank gun to fall from favor in U.S. service, increasingly replaced by conventional tanks or infantry-level anti-tank weapons. Despite this change, the M36 tank destroyer continued in service, and was used in combat as late as the Korean War. The third, and likely most effective kind of tank